Shattering against the oak banister, my skull made a sickening crunch. But it was the suffocating silence afterward that truly destroyed me. My husband remained perfectly quiet. My son made no move to help. They just hovered at the top of the narrow staircase, watching me bleed out onto the cheap synthetic carpet I had spent 3 grueling weeks haggling over. Everything my youth, my comfort, every last penny I ever earned had been sacrificed for those 2 men. Their final repayment was a broken neck. Cold linoleum has a specific bite to it when you've been standing on it for 3 hours. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, and the kitchen smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap, generic brand dish soap. I was scraping the burnt crust off a casserole dish with a frayed fingernail, trying to save the sponge. Sponges cost $1.49 for a pack of 3. If you cut them in half, they last twice as long. That was the math my life was built on. Fractions of cents, squeezed margins. Alessio walked in his heavy boots, tracking a thin film of gray slush onto the floor I had just scrubbed on my hands and knees. He didn't look at the floor. He rarely looked at me either, unless he needed something. At 52, he had the soft, doughy face of a man who believed the world owed him a favor, but lacked the work ethic to collect it. "Did you sign the papers?" he asked. Not hello. Not how was your day at the bakery, working a double shift until your varicose veins throbbed like live wires. I kept my back to him, focusing on the greasy slick of baked-on cheese. No, Alessio, I didn't. We aren't remortgaging the house to fund your brother's cryptocurrency farm. The market is unstable, and that house is entirely paid off. It took me 22 years to pay it off. It took us 22 years. He snapped the pitch of his voice, rising to that familiar, whining register. I paid the mortgage. I said, my voice dead flat. You bought jet skis that rusted in the driveway. You bought timeshares in Florida that went bankrupt. I clipped coupons. I wore my winter coat until the lining dissolved. I paid the bank. A chair scraped violently against the floorboards. Luis, our 24-year-old son, slouched into the kitchen. He smelled of expensive cologne, Tom Ford, bought with my credit card, and stale marijuana. He didn't have a job. He had prospects. Mom, you're being psychotic, Luis muttered, opening the refrigerator and staring blankly into the brightly lit interior, letting the cold air spill out. Dad needs this. I need this. Dad promised me 10% of the initial yield. I'm putting a down payment on a Tesla. Close the door. You're wasting electricity, I said, finally turning around. The air in the room felt thick, like the atmosphere before a severe thunderstorm. I looked at the two of them, my husband, my son, two grown men with soft hands and expensive tastes, floating on a raft made of my bone and sinew. My retirement account had just crossed the $1 million mark. I had achieved it by eating lentil soup 5 days a week, mending my own socks, and walking 3 miles to work in the rain to save bus fare. They had found the quarterly statement I'd hidden in my underwear drawer. Give me the account authorization, Nora, Alessio said. He stepped closer. His breath smelled of stale coffee and peppermint antacids. I'm not asking anymore. You're sitting on a gold mine while we live like peasants. You live like kings, I whispered, the exhaustion settling deep into my marrow. You eat meat every night. You have premium cable. You wear brand-name shoes. I am the only peasant in this house. I walked past them, intending to go upstairs to lock the bedroom door and finally sleep. But Alessio grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug into the cheap, thinning polyester of my sweater. He yanked me backward toward the top of the basement stairs. "You greedy, miserable old witch!" He hissed, his face twisting into a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt. "It's my money, too. I'm the head of this family. You're a parasite." I spat back the decades of suppressed rage, suddenly boiling over. I shoved his chest. I didn't expect Luis to move. My lazy, apathetic son, who couldn't be bothered to take out the garbage, lunged forward. He didn't strike me. He just pushed. Two firm hands squarely on my shoulders. Gravity is a merciless thing. The fall was a chaotic blur of spinning walls and the terrifying rush of displaced air. Then, the brutal final stop. The back of my head struck the sharp corner of the bottom step. I heard the crack before I felt it, a dry snapping sound, like a thick pine branch breaking under heavy snow. I lay awkwardly on the basement floor. I couldn't move my arms. I couldn't feel my legs. A strange, warm wetness began to pool beneath my ear, soaking into the beige fibers of the carpet I had bought from a clearance bin in 1998. Above me, footsteps approached the top of the stairs. "Jesus Luis," Alessio said. His voice wasn't panicked. It was annoyed. "Is she breathing?" "I don't know," Luis replied, sounding breathless. "Did she sign the transfer form yet?" "No. We'll have to forge it. Get her keys. Her purse is in the hallway." They didn't come down to check my pulse. They didn't dial for an ambulance. As my vision narrowed to a pinprick, the last thing I heard was the sound of my husband unzipping my faux leather purse, rifling through the receipts and loose pennies, searching for the key to my safety deposit box. The metallic clinking echoed in my fading consciousness. Then, the absolute crushing dark. Oxygen rushed into my lungs with the violence of a drowning victim breaking the surface. I jackknifed upward, clutching my throat, my chest heaving. The sheets, tangled around my legs, were damp with cold sweat. I waited for the blinding pain in my neck. I waited for the wet stickiness of blood against the back of my skull. Nothing came. The room was pitch black, save for the sickly, green glow of the digital alarm clock on the nightstand. It read 4:15 a.m., but it wasn't the sleek, modern clock Alessio had bought last Christmas. It was the bulky plastic monstrosity with the cracked screen I had found at a yard sale. I touched my face. My skin felt tighter. The deep, weary grooves around my mouth were softer. I looked down at my hands. The arthritic knot in my left index finger, a souvenir from a bakery accident in 2018, was gone. Beside me, a heavy mass shifted under the blankets. Alessio snorted, grinding his teeth in his sleep. A wave of profound, acidic nausea hit me. I scrambled out of bed, my bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor, and sprinted to the attached bathroom. I flipped the light switch, wincing as the harsh fluorescent bulb flickered to life. I leaned over the porcelain sink and stared into the mirror. Dark hair, no gray at the temples, a face that was exhausted, yes, but not yet entirely hollowed out by time and despair. I braced my hands against the edges of the sink. The porcelain was ice cold, real, solid. I stumbled out of the bathroom and crept down the hallway. The house was quiet, humming, with the low vibration of the old refrigerator. I pushed open the door to Luis's room. He was sprawled across his bed, snoring softly. But he wasn't a 24-year-old man with a patchy beard and a drug habit. He was a teenager, maybe 14, maybe 15. His room was cluttered with video game cases and dirty athletic socks. I walked downstairs into the kitchen and found the calendar pinned to the corkboard next to the pantry. October 2011. 15 years. I had been dragged 15 years into the past. I sank into one of the wobbly wooden dining chairs, the rough grain pressing into my palms. My mind fractured into a dozen conflicting realities. The ghost pain of my broken neck still throbbed at the base of my skull. I could still hear Alessio's voice, callously instructing Luis to rifle through my purse while I lay dying in the basement. My first instinct, the deeply ingrained, pathetic habit of a lifetime, was to get up, turn off the kitchen light to save electricity, and start packing Alessio's lunch. A sandwich, bologna, and cheap mustard. Save the leftover crusts for breadcrumbs. I stood up. I walked to the refrigerator. I opened the door and pulled out the package of generic bologna. The plastic felt slimy. I looked at it, really looked at it. For 15 years, I had fed myself scraps. I had eaten the bruised parts of the apples. I had scraped the burnt bottoms of the rice pots. I had sacrificed every atom of my joy, my comfort, and my dignity to build a fortress of financial security for a family that would ultimately step over my bleeding corpse to steal it. My hands began to shake, not with fear, with a white-hot, blinding rage that started in my stomach and radiated out to my fingertips. I took the package of bologna and dropped it into the trash can. Then I walked over to the bread box, took out the loaf of discount white bread, and threw that in the trash too. I threw away the cheap yellow mustard. I threw away the generic coffee grounds that tasted like wet dirt. I pulled open the pantry doors and started hurling boxes of powdered milk and processed pasta onto the linoleum floor. The cardboard boxes hit the ground with dull, satisfying thuds. I stopped chest heaving, standing amidst the wreckage of my own pathetic frugality. "What the hell are you doing?" I froze. Alessio was standing at the bottom of the stairs, squinting against the harsh kitchen light. He was wearing faded flannel pajama pants, his belly hanging slightly over the waistband. He looked younger, but his expression was exactly the same. That perpetual mask of irritation. "It's 4:30 in the morning, Nora," he grumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Have you lost your mind? What is all this garbage on the floor?" I turned to look at him, the man who would in 15 years coldly command our son to forge my signature while I bled out. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. A strange, terrifying calm washed over me, cold and precise. "I dropped a box, Alessio," I said, my voice eerily steady. "I'll clean it up. Go back to sleep." He scowled, shaking his head. "You're making a racket. And keep the thermostat down today. The oil bill was ridiculous last month." He turned and lumbered back up the stairs, the steps groaning under his weight. I watched him go. "Keep the thermostat down." I walked over to the digital thermostat on the hallway wall. It was set to a shivering 60 degrees. I reached out and pressed the upward arrow. 65, 70, 74 degrees. The furnace kicked on with a mighty roaring whoosh, blasting warm air through the floor vents. "Let it burn," I thought, listening to the comforting rumble of the machinery. "Let it all burn down." By 9 a.m., the house was empty. Alessio had driven off to his mid-level logistics job, and Luis had trudged to the bus stop, complaining about the lack of Pop-Tarts in the pantry. I sat at the kitchen table, a yellow legal pad in front of me, tapping a pen against the paper. The morning sun illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. In my previous life today would have been payday. I would have taken my paycheck from the bakery, deposited it into our joint checking account, and then immediately transferred 70% of it into the Vanguard Mutual Fund I managed in secret. Alessio never looked at the bank statements. He only cared that there was enough in checking to cover his golf weekends and his beer tabs. I picked up the phone and dialed the bakery. "Hey, Nora," my manager, a gruff woman named Brenda, answered. "You running late?" "Brenda, I quit," I said. The words tasted foreign on my tongue. "Effective immediately. I won't be coming in." There was a stunned silence on the other end. "Nora, are you serious? You're our best closer." "I'm serious. Mail my final check." I hung up before she could argue. I walked upstairs, stripped off my faded pill-covered sweatpants, and put on the nicest clothes. I owned a pair of dark jeans and a black turtleneck that was only slightly stretched at the collar. I grabbed my purse and my car keys. My first stop was the local branch of First National. I sat across from a junior teller, a young man with a polite, nervous smile. "I need to open a new checking and savings account," I said softly. "Individual, under my name only. I also need a safety deposit box." "Certainly, Mrs. Woods," the teller chirped, clicking away at his keyboard. "Will you be transferring funds from your joint account?" "Yes," I said. "All of it." It wasn't a fortune yet. In 2011, my aggressive saving had only just begun to snowball. There was exactly $42,118 in the joint savings account money I had bled for clipping coupons and working overtime. Alessio contributed nothing to it. He spent his entire salary on car payments, mortgage, and his endless array of useless hobbies. "I want $40,000 moved into my new individual account," I instructed. "Leave the remainder in the joint." The teller hesitated. "That's a significant transfer, ma'am. Will Mr. Woods be needing notification?" "The account requires only one signature for withdrawals," I said, staring unblinkingly into the young man's eyes. "Transfer it." When I walked out of the bank an hour later, I had a new debit card in my wallet, a heavy metal key to a deposit box, and a profound sense of lightness in my chest. At 1 p.m., I parked my beaten-up 1999 Honda Civic in front of Le Petit Chien, a high-end French bistro downtown. It was the kind of place Alessio always pointed to and scoffed at, calling it pretentious nonsense for suckers. I walked in. The air smelled of roasting garlic, rich wine, and melting butter. The host looked at me doubtfully. I was clearly not dressed for a place that served $30 appetizers. But the midday rush was over, and he seated me at a small table by the window. The linen tablecloth felt heavy and starched beneath my fingertips. The silverware was real, weighty steel, not the flimsy, mismatched aluminum I used at home. "What can I get you started with?" the waiter asked, offering a leather-bound menu. In my past life, I hadn't eaten at a restaurant in 7 years. When I did, I ordered tap water and the cheapest side salad, claiming I wasn't hungry, while Alessio devoured a burger. "I will have the bone-in ribeye," I said, my voice steady. "Medium rare, with the truffle pomme puree, and a glass of your most expensive Cabernet." The waiter blinked, then nodded smoothly. "Excellent choice, madam." When the food arrived, I didn't rush. I picked up the steak knife. It sliced through the seared crust of the meat like butter. I took the first bite. The sensory explosion almost brought me to tears. The rich, salty char of the crust gave way to the incredibly tender, fat marbled center. It tasted like indulgence. It tasted like the opposite of a cramped, freezing kitchen. I chewed slowly, letting the savory juices coat my tongue, chasing it with a sip of the heavy, dark red wine. It warmed my throat, pooling in my stomach like liquid velvet. This was what I had traded for discount carpet. This was what I had sacrificed to buy Luis a car he crashed a month later. I finished every bite. The bill came to $142. I left a $50 tip. I walked out into the crisp autumn air, feeling electric. When I got home at 5 p.m., Alessio's truck was already in the driveway. As soon as I unlocked the front door, the shouting started. "Nora!" Alessio bellowed from the kitchen. He stormed into the hallway, waving a printed sheet of paper. His face was flushed red, a vein pulsing at his temple. "What the hell is this?" I checked the online banking to pay the credit card, and the savings account is empty. Where is the 40 grand? Luis appeared at the top of the stairs, headphones slung around his neck, looking mildly amused by his father's rage. "Mom, did you get hacked?" I took off my coat, hanging it carefully on the hook. The smell of the expensive restaurant still clung to my hair. "I moved it," I said, simply, walking past Alessio toward the kitchen. He grabbed my arm, the exact same grip, the exact same spot he had grabbed before he pushed me down the stairs, 15 years in the future. My body went rigid. I looked down at his heavy, fleshy hand, and then up into his sweaty face. "Let go of me," I whispered. The tone of my voice was so venomous, so completely devoid of my usual passive submission, that he blinked in shock and released his grip. "I moved it into an account you cannot access." I continued smoothing the fabric of my sleeve. "Your brother called me yesterday, Alessio. I know you were planning to take $20,000 out to invest in that ridiculous sports memorabilia business of his. So I protected the assets." "You protected," he sputtered, spit flying from his lips. "That is my money. I am your husband. Put it back." "No," I said, pouring myself a glass of tap water. I took a slow sip. "If you want to invest in your brother's pyramid scheme, use your 401k. Take a hardship withdrawal, but you aren't touching the liquid savings." "I can't take a withdrawal without paying penalties," he yelled, slamming his hand on the counter. "You stupid stubborn, then don't invest," I interrupted smoothly. "Or do. I really don't care, Alessio, but the bank account is locked, and if you ever grab my arm like that again, I will break your fingers." Luis let out a low whistle from the stairs. "Damn, Mom." Alessio stood there, completely paralyzed by a version of me he had never met. The obedient, terrified little penny pincher was dead. She died on the basement floor. He eventually stormed out, slamming the front door so hard the framed family photos rattled against the drywall. I smiled a thin, cruel curvature of the lips. I wasn't just going to leave them. Leaving was too easy. They didn't know how to survive without me playing the martyr. I was going to stay just long enough to watch them destroy themselves with their own greed, and then I was going to walk away with everything. Morning frost coated the kitchen window like a thin layer of crushed glass. The house was freezing. I hadn't touched the thermostat since yesterday's argument, letting the temperature drop overnight to a biting 58 degrees. I sat at the table, wrapped in a thick, luxurious cashmere cardigan I had purchased the previous afternoon. It cost $300. The wool was impossibly soft against my bare neck, a stark contrast to the itchy, acrylic sweaters I usually bought from the discount racks at strip malls. A heavy porcelain mug rested between my palms, radiating heat. Inside was dark roast coffee, freshly ground from beans that smelled of dark chocolate and toasted nuts. No more instant powder, no more chicory blends meant to stretch the dollar. Upstairs, a door opened with a violent creak. Heavy footsteps thudded down the hallway. "Nora!" Alessio's voice boomed thick with sleep and irritation. "Why is there no hot water?" I took a slow sip of my coffee. The bitterness bloomed perfectly on the back of my tongue. I didn't answer. A moment later, Alessio appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was shivering, a towel wrapped around his waist, his sparse chest hair standing on end. His wet feet left damp, pathetic little puddles on the linoleum. "The shower is ice cold." He snapped his jaw tight. "Did you forget to pay the gas bill?" "The bill is paid," I said, turning the page of the morning newspaper. I wasn't actually reading it. I was just enjoying the crisp, papery sound it made. "The water heater is 20 years old, Alessio. It needs 30 minutes to recover after someone takes a long shower. Luis was in there for 45 minutes. "Well, fix it," he demanded, pointing a thick finger at me. "Call a plumber or turn up the boiler. You own a phone," I replied, not looking up from the crossword puzzle. "And you know where the basement is. I'm off the clock." Alessio stared at me, his mouth slightly open, processing the refusal. For 20 years, if a light bulb flickered, if a hinge squeaked, if the water ran cold, I was the one who fixed it. I crawled under sinks with wrenches. I watched YouTube tutorials on drywall repair to save us hiring a handyman. I did the invisible, thankless labor that kept the structure of his life from collapsing. "Off the clock," he repeated, a sneer, twisting his upper lip. "What is wrong with you lately? You quit your job, you steal my money. Now, you're just sitting around in a fancy sweater while the house falls apart." "It's not your money," I corrected, gently, finally looking up. "And it's your house, too. Start acting like it." He muttered a string of curses under his breath, turned on his heel, and stomped back upstairs to put on cold clothes. By noon, the reality of my strike began to set in. The laundry basket in the hallway overflowed with Luis's pungent, sweat-stained gym clothes and Alessio's mustard-spotted work shirts. Normally, Sunday was wash day. I would spend 6 hours separating darks, treating stains with baking soda, and hanging shirts on a clothesline in the backyard to save the 40 cents it cost to run the electric dryer. Today, I walked right past the pile. Luis emerged from his bedroom at 1 o'clock. He slouched into the kitchen, wearing the same crumpled t-shirt he had slept in. He opened the refrigerator, stared into it for a full minute, and sighed dramatically. "Mom, there's nothing to eat." "There are eggs," I said, peeling the plastic film off a container of imported raspberries. "I don't know how to make eggs." He whined, scratching the back of his neck. "Where are the frozen waffles? Or the pizza rolls?" "I didn't buy any." I popped a raspberry into my mouth. It burst with a tart, vibrant sweetness. "If you want them, go to the store. You have a car." "I don't have any money," Luis said, leaning against the counter. He looked at me with those wide, expectant eyes, the eyes of a boy who had never been told no, the eyes of a man who would one day watch his father rifle through my dying body for a bank key. A sudden sharp nausea rolled through my stomach. It wasn't the food. It was a visceral physical revulsion to my own flesh and blood. I looked at his hands, soft, uncalloused, clean, hands that had pushed me. "Then get a job, Luis," I said. My voice was a dead flat line. He recoiled as if I had slapped him. "I'm looking. You know the market is garbage right now. Dad said I shouldn't take a minimum wage gig. It ruins my resume." "Your dad is an idiot," I said calmly. "And if you don't wash your own laundry by tonight, it's going out on the lawn. The smell is making me sick. I stood up, took my bowl of raspberries, and walked into the living room, leaving him standing in the kitchen, utterly bewildered. I sat on the sofa and turned on the television. I didn't care what was playing. I just wanted the noise to drown out the sudden, erratic hammering of my own heart. A part of me, the old Nora, the pathetic, desperate woman who believed that compliance was the rent you paid for love, wanted to get up, apologize, fry him an egg, and do his laundry. It was a muscle memory of subservience. It tugged at my chest, a phantom limb of maternal guilt. But then, I touched the back of my neck. I pressed my fingers into the skin just above my spine, remembering the exact spot where the bone would splinter. The guilt evaporated, replaced by a cold, metallic resolve. I was not their mother anymore. I was not a wife. I was a demolition crew, and the building was already rigged. The air in the house grew increasingly toxic over the next 2 weeks. Dust gathered on the baseboards. The trash cans in the kitchen overflowed with takeout containers because neither of my men knew how to boil water, and I refused to cook a single grain of rice. I ate out. I went to bakeries, bistros, and sushi bars. I brought nothing back. Alessio's desperation was becoming palpable. His brother Greg was heavily pressuring him to invest in a sketchy commercial real estate venture, a strip mall in a dying suburb. In my past life, Alessio had begged me to co-sign a second mortgage for it. I had refused, leading to months of screaming matches, but I had held the line. Now the line didn't exist. I had taken the only liquid cash we had. It was a Thursday evening. The sky outside was a bruised, dark purple, and the autumn wind rattled the loose panes of the living room windows. I was sitting in the armchair, reading a hardcover novel I had bought at full retail price when Alessio walked in. He didn't take off his coat. He smelled of cheap draft beer and desperation. He dropped a thick manila envelope onto the coffee table with a heavy smack. "There," he said, his breathing shallow. "Since you decided to hoard our money like a dragon, I handled it myself." I marked my page and closed the book, resting it in my lap. I looked at the envelope. "What is that?" "Alessio. It's a 401k hardship withdrawal," he said, puffing his chest out slightly, trying to project a dominance he didn't possess. "I liquidated 60% of my retirement, $45,000. After the early withdrawal penalties and taxes, I'll clear about 28 grand. Greg only needs 25 for the buy-in." I stared at him. The sheer, unadulterated stupidity of it was almost awe-inspiring. He was 52 years old. He had barely $70,000 in that account, the only safety net he had outside of my savings. And he was setting fire to it, eating a massive tax penalty just to spite me and play businessman with his brother. I had to suppress a bark of dark laughter that clawed at my throat. It was perfect. It was better than anything I could have orchestrated. "You cashed out your retirement," I stated, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. "I made a strategic investment," he countered, narrowing his eyes. "Greg says the property value will triple in 5 years. We'll lease the storefronts to high-end boutiques. I'll make back the penalty in 6 months of passive income." "Boutiques," I repeated, "in a neighborhood where the anchor store is a pawn shop. You don't know anything about real estate, Nora. You spent your whole life selling cupcakes." He leaned over the table, pointing a finger at my face. "You think you're so smart because you hid some cash in a private account. I don't need you. I'm building generational wealth for me and Luis." Generational wealth. The phrase sounded absurd, coming from a man who currently had a ketchup stain on his collar. and financed a jet ski at 12% interest. I see, I said, folding my hands over my book. Well, it's your account. You're free to ruin yourself, however you see fit. I'm not ruining myself. He yelled, his face flushing that familiar dangerous red. I'm taking control. When this pays out, don't come crying to me for a cut. I wouldn't dream of it. He snatched the envelope off the table and stormed upstairs, victorious in his own delusional mind. I sat alone in the living room, listening to the wind howling against the glass. The trap was set, and he had walked into it with a smile on his face. By draining his 401k, he was severely diminishing his share of the marital assets. When the time came to untangle our lives legally, his depleted retirement would mean I kept a larger portion of the house's equity. Or better yet, I could force a sale without owing him a dime of my own protected accounts. The next morning, I drove to the industrial park on the edge of town. I wasn't going shopping. I had an appointment. The office of Hayes and Croft Family Law smelled of lemon pledge and stale coffee. The waiting room was painfully beige, designed, I imagined, to soothe people whose lives were actively falling apart. I didn't need soothing. I felt sharper than a newly honed chef's knife. Mrs. Woods, a tall, austere woman in a tailored gray suit, stood in the doorway of her office. Miriam Hayes. I had researched her extensively. She had a reputation for being completely devoid of sentimentality, a butcher in the courtroom who specialized in financially complex divorces. "Call me Nora," I said, standing up and offering my hand. Her grip was firm, dry. I sat down in the leather chair opposite her heavy oak desk. She opened a fresh legal pad, uncapped a silver fountain pen, and looked at me over the rim of her reading glasses. "So, Nora, tell me about your situation." "My husband is a financial parasite," I said, my voice steady, devoid of any tremor or tears. "He is currently draining his retirement accounts to fund a fraudulent real estate scheme organized by his brother. Our son is a 24-year-old dependent who refuses to work." Miriam's pen scratched quietly against the paper. She didn't look surprised. I doubted anything surprised her. "And your assets? The house is paid off, jointly owned, valued at roughly $300,000. I have $42,000 in a liquid savings account under my name only. I intend to file for divorce, but not immediately. I need to position myself so that when the financial ruin he is orchestrating finally hits, I am entirely insulated." And he walks away with nothing. Miriam stopped writing. She looked up, her gaze piercing. A slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a shark spotting blood in the water. "Usually women come in here crying, asking how to save their marriages," Miriam said, tapping her pen against the desk. "Or asking for fair splits. You don't want fair, do you, Nora?" "I want exactly what I paid for," I said softly, the memory of the basement stairs flashing in my mind's eye, the cold carpet, the heavy silence. I spent 22 years buying that house, with my sweat and my starvation. He doesn't get to keep a single brick. In this state, assets acquired during the marriage are typically split 50-50, Miriam warned, leaning back in her chair. "However, if we can prove gross financial dissipation, meaning he is recklessly squandering marital assets, without your consent, we can argue for a disproportionate share of the remaining estate. The house, he just took a hardship withdrawal from his 401k to give to his brother," I said. "He forged my signature on a tax document a decade ago, which I can prove. and he's about to sink everything into a strip mall that is legally zoned for demolition. Miriam's eyebrows shot up. Zoned for demolition, are you sure? I checked the city planning records this morning. I replied, a cold satisfaction settling in my chest. His brother is scamming him. The city claimed eminent domain on that lot last month to expand the highway bypass. Any money invested there is already gone. And you didn't tell your husband this. Why would I asked, meeting her gaze evenly. He told me he was building generational wealth. I wouldn't want to stand in his way. Miriam chuckled a dry, rattling sound. Nora Woods, you are a very dangerous woman. I used to be a very frugal one. I corrected her. I'm just learning how to spend. Dust possesses a specific gritty texture when you finally stop wiping it away. It settles over everything: the cheap veneer of the television, stand the glass of the framed wedding photo in the hallway, the drooping leaves of the spider plant hanging by the window. For 22 years, I was the invisible shield keeping the decay at bay. Now, I let the rot creep in. By the third week of November, the house smelled perpetually of sour milk and damp polyester. I had made good on my promise. Luis's mountain of filthy laundry had been unceremoniously dumped on the front lawn. It rained 2 days later. The pile just sat there, a soggy, pungent monument to his weaponized incompetence. He eventually dragged it into the garage, but he didn't wash it. He just started buying new cheap t-shirts with his dwindling allowance, leaving the wet pile to mildew in the dark. I was sitting at the kitchen island, meticulously peeling a perfectly ripe mandarin orange. The citrus oil sprayed lightly against my fingertips, sharp and bright, cutting through the stale air. The front door slammed open, rattling the loose hinges. Alessio marched in, flanked by his younger brother Greg. Greg was a man who looked exactly like the bad decisions he made. He wore a boxy, oversized suit that was meant to look expensive, but possessed the stiff, shiny drape of cheap synthetic blends. He smelled aggressively of drugstore cologne and stale cigarette smoke. His hair was slicked back, revealing a receding hairline, glistening with nervous sweat. In here, Greg Alessio bellowed his voice, carrying the obnoxious, booming cadence of a man who thought he had finally won. Grab the glasses, top shelf. They ignored me entirely. Alessio pulled a bottle of mid-tier bourbon from a brown paper bag, the glass clinking sharply against the faux granite countertop. He didn't use coasters. He poured 2 heavy amber measures into water glasses, splashing a few drops onto the counter. I watched the liquid bead up and begin to eat into the cheap sealant. I didn't reach for a sponge. To the Oak Street Plaza, Greg said, raising his glass. He had a nervous tick, a slight twitch in his left eyelid when he smiled. And to getting in on the ground floor. The paperwork is filed, Artie. The wire transferred this morning. We are officially commercial landlords. Alessio grinned, a wide, fleshy expression that pushed his eyes into greedy little slits. He clinked his glass against Greg's. To generational wealth. No more punching the clock for the man. We let the asset work for us. They drank. The smell of the harsh alcohol wafted over to me, mixing unpleasantly with the sweet citrus of my orange. I popped a vibrant, juicy segment of mandarin into my mouth. It tasted like sunlight. Oak Street, I said quietly. Both men paused, finally acknowledging my presence in the room. Alessio's triumphant grin tightened into a scowl. Don't start, Nora, Alessio warned, pointing a thick, calloused finger at me. This doesn't concern you. You opted out, remember. You hid your little nest egg. This is my play. I merely said the name of the street. I replied, my voice light, airy, completely devoid of the nagging anxiety that used to define my every waking moment. Oak Street. It has a lovely ring to it. Where exactly is the plaza? Greg shifted his weight, his cheap leather shoes squeaking against the linoleum. East End, just past the old rail yard. It's a transitional neighborhood, lots of potential for gentrification. Transitional. I repeated, tasting the word. I knew exactly where it was. It was a block of dilapidated brick storefronts, riddled with black mold, sitting squarely in the path of the city's new infrastructure project. The city had published the eminent domain notices in the back pages of the local newspaper, the pages Alessio never read because he was too busy checking the sports scores. It's a gold mine, Alessio snapped, irritated by my lack of visible jealousy. We bought the deed for a song. The previous owner was desperate to liquidate. Idiot didn't know what he was sitting on. Clearly, I murmured, swallowing the fruit. I wiped my hands on a crisp, white paper towel. I didn't tear it in half to save money. I used the whole sheet. Luis shuffled into the kitchen, his bare feet slapping loudly against the floor. He looked haggard. The lack of constant hovering mothering was aging him rapidly. He stared at the bottle of bourbon, then at his uncle. Hey, Uncle Greg. Dad, can I get $40? My tank is empty, and I need to go to an interview. Alessio, riding the high of his imaginary future, riches, reached into his wallet and pulled out 2 crisp $20 bills. He handed them to Luis with a grand, sweeping gesture. Go get 'em, son. Won't be long before I buy you that new car I promised. A phantom ache flared at the base of my skull. I'm putting a down payment on a Tesla. The echo of a future that would never happen rang in my ears. Thanks, Dad, Luis muttered, grabbing the cash. He didn't look at me. I was just the furniture now, a stubborn, malfunctioning appliance they had decided to ignore. We're going out to celebrate, Alessio announced, clapping Greg on the shoulder. He looked down his nose at me. Don't wait up, Nora. Actually, don't bother doing anything at all. You seem to be great at it lately. Have a wonderful evening, Alessio, I said softly. I watched them leave the door, slamming shut behind them. The house fell back into its heavy, oppressive silence. I looked at the spilled bourbon on the counter. It was drying into a sticky, amber stain. They were celebrating their own funeral, and they had bought the shovels with their own money. Winter arrived with a brutal, unforgiving swiftness. By the second week of December, the frost on the windows had thickened into a permanent, opaque glaze of ice. The furnace roared constantly, burning through heating oil at an astronomical rate, driven by the thermostat. I kept locked at a balmy 72 degrees. The financial strain was beginning to show on Alessio. He was irritable, snapping at the slightest provocation. The grocery bills had tripled because he and Luis were living entirely on delivery pizzas and microwavable steaks. The checking account, the one he solely deposited his paycheck into, now was bleeding out. It happened on a Tuesday. The mail carrier, heavily bundled in navy blue wool, dropped a thick stack of envelopes through the mail slot in the front door. They landed on the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. I was sitting in the living room, drinking a cup of expensive, loose-leaf, Earl Grey tea. I watched Alessio bend down his knees, popping audibly to scoop up the pile. He sorted through them carelessly, Bill's junk mail, a catalog. Then he stopped. His thumb hovered over a thick, cream-colored envelope. It bore the embossed seal of the City Municipal Planning Commission. The air in the room seemed to suddenly compress. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the refrigerator in the next room. Alessio tore the top of the envelope off with a jagged, clumsy motion. He unfolded the heavy official letterhead. His eyes darted back and forth across the page. I watched the color drain from his face. It wasn't a slow fade. It was a rapid, sickening flush of gray, like wet cement. His jaw went slack. The paper in his hands began to tremble, creating a faint, high-pitched rustling noise. "No," he whispered. The word barely escaped his throat. It was choked, desperate. He read it again, then a third time. He dropped the envelope. It fluttered to the floor, landing next to a dust bunny. "Alessio," I asked, my voice smooth as glass. "Bad news." He didn't look at me. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his thick fingers fumbling wildly with the keypad. He pressed the phone to his ear, pacing in a tight, panicked circle in the hallway. "Pick up," he hissed. "Pick up the phone, Greg. Pick up." He was greeted by voicemail. He hung up and dialed again. Voicemail. "Son of a..." he swore, hurling the phone against the wall. The plastic casing cracked, sliding down the drywall to join the discarded envelope. He finally turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, glassy, with an animal terror. The arrogant, booming patriarch from 3 weeks ago was gone. In his place stood a terrified, aging man who had just realized the ice beneath his feet had shattered. They're tearing it down. He choked out his chest, heaving. "Tearing what down?" I asked, taking a slow, measured sip of my tea. The bergamot oil was fragrant and deeply calming. "The plaza, Oak Street?" He yelled, his voice cracking into a shrill register. He lunged forward, snatching the letter off the floor and shoving it toward my face. "The city, eminent domain. They issued the final condemnation notice today. The previous owner knew he knew, and he sold the deed to Greg." "That sounds like a very unfortunate oversight," I said, placing my teacup delicately onto a saucer. It made a crisp, polite clink. "Unfortunate?" he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "It's gone, Nora. The money is gone. The city is seizing the land for pennies on the dollar. The payout won't even cover the legal fees to fight it. My retirement, my entire $45,000, is vaporized." He grabbed his hair, pulling at the roots, pacing the floor like a caged animal. The reality was crashing down on him in heavy, suffocating waves. He had burned his only safety net for a scam. "Call Greg," he shouted, pointing at my phone, resting on the end table. "Maybe he'll answer you. He took my money, Nora. He swore it was a sure thing." "I don't think Greg is going to answer anyone today, Alessio," I said, softly. He stopped pacing. He looked at me, his chest rising and falling heavily. Slowly, a new realization crept into his panicked eyes. He saw the calmness in my posture. He saw the expensive tea, the clean clothes, the utter lack of surprise on my face. "You knew," he breathed, the words barely audible. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. "You knew," he roared, crossing the room in 3 massive strides. He stood over me, his face twisted in absolute fury. "You let me sign the papers. You let me drain my account." "I didn't let you do anything," I said, leaning back into the cushions. I felt no fear, only a deep, satisfying closure. "You explicitly told me it didn't concern me. You told me you were building generational wealth without me. I simply respected your boundaries as the head of the household. You evil, vindictive." He reached for me, his hands curling into fists, his knuckles turning white. I stood up, moving, with a sudden sharp fluidity that caught him off guard. I stepped entirely out of his reach, picking up my purse from the armchair. "Don't touch me, Alessio. Not ever again." My voice was a razor. It sliced through his blind rage, hitting bone. He froze his hands, trembling in the space between us. "We have a mortgage payment due in 8 days." He stammered, his anger rapidly deflating back into raw panic. "The oil bill is astronomical. My checking account is overdrawn. You need to unlock the savings, Nora. You have $40,000. We need it to float us until I figure this out. I have to hire a lawyer to sue Greg." I looked at the man I had served for 2 decades, the man who had worn my youth like a cheap coat and thrown it away when it frayed. "There is no we, Alessio," I said, unzipping my purse. I reached inside and pulled out a manila envelope. It was thinner than the one he had brought home, but infinitely heavier in consequence. I tossed it onto the coffee table. It slid across the polished wood, stopping perfectly against his cracked cell phone. He looked down at it. "What is that?" "A petition for dissolution of marriage," I said. "Drafted by Miriam Hayes. You'll find she is very thorough." Alessio stared at the envelope as if it were a live grenade. "Divorce. Now. Nora, I just lost my retirement. You can't do this now. I need that savings account. The savings account is in my name, established with funds I earned," I explained coldly. "The law will look at how the marital assets were managed. You unilaterally drained $45,000 of marital property and invested it in a condemned property against basic financial sense. It's called dissipation of assets, Alessio. Miriam assures me the judge will not be sympathetic." I walked toward the hallway, slipping my arms into my heavy wool coat. "Where are you going?" he yelled, panic completely taking over. He sounded exactly like Luis when the internet went down, completely helpless. "I'm going to a hotel," I said, opening the front door. The freezing winter air rushed into the stifling house, biting at my cheeks. "I've paid for a month in advance. You and Luis have 30 days to figure out how to pay the mortgage, or the bank takes the house. And since you have no liquid cash, I suggest you start packing." I walked out, pulling the door shut behind me. The heavy click of the lock falling into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The mattress in room 412 of the Oakbridge Suites was aggressively. It didn't dip in the middle. It didn't creak when I shifted my weight. The sheets felt stiff, smelling faintly of industrial bleach and high-temperature steam pressing. It was the scent of labor performed by someone else. For the first 3 nights, I barely slept. My body, conditioned by 22 years of high-alert anxiety, kept bracing for a heavy footstep in the hallway, waiting for a booming voice to demand a clean shirt or a hot meal. But the silence held. By day 4, the phantom pains began to subside. I stopped touching the back of my neck. My cell phone rested on the generic laminate nightstand, vibrating with a relentless mechanical rhythm. 73 missed calls from Alessio, 41 from Luis. The text messages ranged from furious, misspelled threats of legal destruction to pathetic whining, pleas for grocery money. I read them all. I didn't reply to a single one. Reading them was like studying a foreign language. I had finally forgotten how to speak. On Thursday afternoon, the phone rang, and the caller ID flashed Miriam Hayes' office number. I picked it up. "Nora," Miriam said. Her voice was as dry and efficient as a freshly printed bank statement. "I have updates. Alessio failed to retain counsel. He submitted a handwritten response to our petition, demanding half of your individual savings account and alimony. I let out a short, hollow laugh. The sheer audacity of the man was a marvel. On what grounds? He claims he was the primary breadwinner, and you abandoned the marital home, causing him undue financial hardship. Miriam replied, the amusement barely concealed in her tone. I've already filed a motion to dismiss his claim based on gross dissipation. I attached the bank records showing his unilateral 401k withdrawal and the city's condemnation notice for the plaza. The judge reviewed it this morning, and the judge was severely unimpressed with your husband. Miriam said, the scratch of her fountain pen echoing through the receiver. Alessio's request for access to your accounts was denied. Furthermore, because he currently has zero liquid assets and cannot maintain the marital property, the court is allowing the foreclosure process to proceed unhindered. The bank issued the default notice yesterday. He missed the property tax deadline. They are accelerating the seizure. How long does he have? I asked, looking out the hotel window. The sky was a pale, bruised gray. Given the unpaid taxes and his inability to turn the utilities back on 30 days before the sheriff posts the eviction notice, he is effectively bankrupt Nora. He built his own coffin, nailed it shut, and handed us the hammer. Thank you, Miriam, I said quietly. I hung up the phone. I didn't feel a triumphant surge of adrenaline. I didn't pump my fist in the air. I just felt a strange, profound emptiness. When you spend 2 decades carrying a crushing weight, the sudden absence of it leaves you feeling weightless, untethered. An hour later, the receptionist called up from the lobby. Ms. Woods, there is a young man down here asking for you. He says he's your son. I closed my eyes. Send him up. 5 minutes later, a timid knock rattled my door. I opened it. Luis stood in the hallway, and the sight of him sent a complicated knot of revulsion and lingering maternal instinct twisting in my gut. He looked terrible. His expensive cologne was entirely masked by the sour stench of unwashed hair and stale sweat. He was wearing a thin designer hoodie, shivering violently in the drafty corridor. His cheeks were hollowed out, the arrogant sneer completely erased from his face. Mom, he croaked, his voice cracking. He looked past me, his eyes darting toward the warmth of the room. Can I come in? I stood squarely in the doorway. I didn't step back. What do you want, Luis? Dad is insane. He blurted out, wrapping his arms around himself. The heat is off. The electric company shut the power down yesterday. We're sleeping in our winter coats. He just sits in the dark, drinking whatever is left in the liquor cabinet, muttering about Uncle Greg. He won't even look for a job. Mom, I haven't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. He looked at me with those wide, pleading eyes. The eyes of a child trapped in a grown man's body. He expected me to crumble. He expected me to usher him inside order room service and stroke his hair. I looked at his hands. I remembered the firm, deliberate push against my shoulders, the rough plunge down the wooden stairs. You are 24 years old. I stated, my voice completely devoid of warmth. You have a car. You have 2 working arms. Why haven't you bought yourself a hot meal? Luis blinked, stunned by the coldness of my tone. My card declined. Dad took the last $50 out of my account to buy gas for his truck. Mom, please, just let me stay here for a few nights. Just until Dad figures out the house. There is no house to figure out, Luis. The bank is foreclosing. You and your father are going to be evicted. Panic seized his features. What? No. No, Dad said he was getting a lawyer. He said he was going to sue you for the savings account and fix everything. Your father is a liar and a fool, I said flatly. And you are a parasite who chose to attach yourself to a dying host. I warned you to get a job. I warned you to learn how to survive. You chose to wait for a handout that is never coming. You're my mother. He yelled his desperation, morphing back into that familiar entitled anger. You're just going to let me freeze on the street. What kind of psycho does that? The kind of psycho who finally realized her son would watch her bleed to death if it meant he got a new car, I said. The words slipped out before I could stop them. They made no sense to him. This Luis hadn't done it yet. This Luis hadn't pushed me down the stairs. But the capacity to do it was written into the very marrow of his bones. I saw it in the selfish curl of his lip, in the way he viewed me, not as a human being, but as a resource to be consumed. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered, stepping back, genuinely unnerved by the dead look in my eyes. Go to a shelter, Luis, I said, or go sleep in your car, but do not ever come to my door again. If you do, I will have you arrested for trespassing. I shut the door in his face. I threw the deadbolt. The heavy metal click echoed in the quiet room. I walked over to the mini fridge, pulled out a cold bottle of sparkling water, and drank it. It tasted crisp, clean, unburdened. Late February in the Northeast is a miserable gray affair. The snow doesn't look like a postcard. It looks like dirty, crushed concrete piled against the curbs. The wind howls off the pavement, biting through layers of wool and denim. I parked my rented sedan at the end of my old street. The heater was blasting, keeping the cabin a comfortable 74 degrees. I gripped the leather steering wheel, watching the house through the frost-rimmed windshield. It looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. The gutters I used to clean by hand were overflowing with dead frozen leaves. The front lawn was a graveyard of frozen brown weeds. A heavy yellow tow truck was backed into the driveway. Two burly men in high-visibility jackets were currently hooking heavy chains to Alessio's prized jet skis. The watercrafts, bought on credit and used exactly 3 times, looked absurd, sitting on their rusty trailers in the dead of winter. Alessio stood on the crumbling concrete walkway, watching them. He looked like a deflated balloon. He was wearing the same stained winter coat he'd owned for a decade, but it hung loosely on his frame now. He had lost at least 20 pounds. His face, once flushed with perpetual arrogance, was pallid and sagging, with deep, grayish bags under his eyes. He wasn't yelling at the repo men. He wasn't puffing out his chest. He just stood there, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, staring blankly as the winch squealed, dragging his expensive toys onto the flatbed. A police cruiser was parked on the curb, its light bar flashing a slow, methodical blue and red against the dirty snow. The eviction was official. The front door opened, and Luis trudged out. He was carrying a black plastic trash bag, filled with whatever clothes he had managed to salvage. He tossed the bag into the bed of Alessio's rusted pickup truck, which was currently sputtering and coughing exhaust fumes into the freezing air. Luis yelled something at his father, throwing his hands up in frustration. Alessio didn't even turn his head. He just gave a weak, dismissive wave. They were broken, completely, utterly dismantled. The bank had seized the property. The savings were untouchable. Greg had vanished into thin air, leaving Alessio holding the bag on a worthless, condemned plot of land. Their credit was destroyed, their assets liquidated. and their future erased. I watched Alessio climb heavily into the driver's seat of the pickup. Luis slammed the passenger door shut. The truck's engine whined, protesting the cold, before Alessio finally wrestled it into gear. The truck limped out of the driveway, pulling away from the house I had scrubbed, painted, and paid for, with the best years of my life. They didn't look back. They didn't have anywhere to go. A weekly motel on the edge of town, maybe. A friend's couch until they wore out their welcome. The details didn't matter to me. I sat in my warm car, listening to the soft rhythm of the engine. I reached up and touched the back of my neck. The skin was smooth. The bone was solid. There was no pain, no blood, no cold basement floor waiting to swallow me in the dark. I put the car in drive. I didn't look at the house as I passed it. It was just a building, now empty and cold. I turned the steering wheel, merging onto the main road, heading away from the suburbs, away from the discount grocery stores, away from the heavy, suffocating gravity of my past. The sky ahead began to clear, a thin sliver of pale winter sunlight breaking through the gray clouds. It illuminated the dashboard, catching the edge of my new leather purse. Inside, it was a fresh bank card, a finalized divorce decree, and a one-way plane ticket to the coast. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The engine purred smoothly. For the first time in 22 years, the only person I was driving forward was myself. This is just the beginning of Nora's ruthless journey to reclaim her life. Will Alessio and Luis figure out her plan, or will their own greed be their absolute undoing? Drop a comment below and tell me what you would do if you woke up next to the people who betrayed you. If you're hooked on this story of ultimate revenge and financial ruin, smash that like button, hit share to support the channel, and subscribe so you don't miss part 4. The real payback has only just started.